Welcome to Calvin's Stories, where a man who built everything refuses to be erased. Enjoy.
My name is Marcus Ellison. I'm 59 years old. On a Tuesday night last October, I was sitting in my dead brother's office at 11 o'clock at night with a flash drive plugged into a laptop that wasn't mine. And I found 34 invoices billed to men who were already in the ground. The payments didn't go to our firm. They went to a company I'd never heard of, registered to an address I'd never seen, and the person who built the entire thing was my son. If you think you know where this story is going, I promise you don't. Because the invoices were only the surface. What was underneath them nearly took everything my family ever built. Welcome back to this channel, where we tell real stories about the moments that change everything. The moments where trust breaks, and the truth has to be dug out by hand. If this story hits you the way it hit me to live it, take a second and subscribe. Because these are the kind of stories that don't get told enough. And the people living them need to know they aren't alone. Drop a comment if you've ever looked at a number on a page and felt your whole understanding of someone shift. Now let me take you back. Because to understand what I found on that flash drive, you have to understand the life I was living before I opened it. I was born and raised in Charlotte, North Carolina. Went to NC State, studied mechanical engineering, and spent 31 years working with systems that had to function or people got hurt. Compressors, chillers, heat exchangers, ductwork for hospitals and schools. There is no faking it in mechanical engineering. A bearing fails, a compressor seizes, a pressure differential gets ignored, and someone's operating room loses climate control in the middle of a surgery. I learned early that you check everything, you document everything. And you never assume a system is running clean, just because it sounds right. That discipline followed me home. After I retired at 54, I kept spreadsheets for groceries. I labeled every drawer in my tool bench. My morning routine was timed to the minute. Coffee at 6:12, news until 6:40, walk the block twice, shower, dressed by 7:30. My wife Connie used to say I was the only man alive who could make a Saturday feel like a flight checklist. Connie. I need to talk about Connie because without her, none of what happened makes sense. She died 2 years ago this past March. Ovarian cancer. Diagnosed late, moved fast. 14 months from the first scan to the last breath. She was 55. We'd been married 32 years. And if you asked me what the organizing principle of my life was after retirement, it was her. Not because I was dependent, but because she was the person who made the house feel inhabited instead of maintained. She laughed at things I didn't think were funny and made me laugh anyway. She kept a garden that looked like a small act of defiance against the clay soil in our yard. She believed in people with a ferocity that I found both beautiful and, if I'm honest, naive. She believed in our son Trent most of all. Trent was our only child. Born when Connie was 27 and I was 27. Raised in this house. Played baseball at Myers Park High School. Went to Appalachian State. Graduated with a business degree. He was charming in the way that people who've never had to struggle can be charming. Easy smile. Firm handshake. The kind of eye contact that makes you feel like you're the most important person in the room. Connie adored him. She used to say Trent had her heart and my head, and I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe he had both. When Trent graduated, my brother Dale and I had been running our HVAC consulting firm for about 12 years, Ellison and Thornton Mechanical Consulting. Dale was the front of house guy, the relationship builder. I was the systems man, the engineer, the one who made sure the technical side was airtight. Our silent partner was Gil Thornton, who owned 15%. Gil was Dale's old college friend, a quiet man from Raleigh, who put up seed money when we started, and never asked for more than his quarterly check. He came to 0 meetings. He signed what needed signing. He cashed what needed cashing. I barely thought about Gil most years, and I think that's exactly how Gil preferred it. Trent came into the firm 6 years ago. Dale brought him in, actually, trained him on client relations, invoicing, the basics of project management. Trent took to it the way a smart kid takes to anything that isn't too hard and pays well enough. Within 2 years, he was managing a portfolio of clients and handling the billing software. I was already winding down my involvement by then. Connie was sick, and my world had narrowed to the space between our bedroom and the oncology ward at Atrium Health. When Connie died, something in me broke in a way I couldn't repair. The grief wasn't dramatic. It was architectural. Like a load-bearing wall had been removed and I was waiting for the ceiling to come down. I managed it the only way I knew how, which was structure. More spreadsheets, more routine, more order imposed on a world that had just demonstrated how little control I actually had. Dale understood. He'd lost his own wife to a car accident 15 years earlier. He didn't try to talk me through it. He just showed up on Saturdays with biscuits from Bojangles and sat on my porch and didn't say much. Dale was the person who kept me from disappearing into my own systems, my own labels, my own timed routines that were really just ways of pretending the day had purpose. 8 months ago, Dale had a stroke. Massive. He was in his office on a Thursday afternoon, and his assistant found him on the floor at 4:15. He was dead before the paramedics cleared the parking lot. 61 years old. My brother. The last person in my life who knew me from before. Who remembered the version of me that existed before grief. Became my primary occupation. Dale's will was simple. His share of the firm went to me, making me the majority partner. His instructions, written in his own hand in a letter attached to the will, said he wanted me to transition the business to Trent. "The kid's ready," Dale had written. "Let him have it. You've earned your rest." I believed that. I wanted to believe that. Connie would have believed it without hesitation. So I started the transition. The first thing I noticed was small. I was reviewing the client database as part of the handoff, and Trent had restructured it. The old system was simple, alphabetical. Each client folder containing contracts, invoices, correspondence. Trent had created a new category called Managed Portfolio and moved about 40 accounts into it. When I asked him about it, he didn't blink. Just better organization, Dad. Legacy clients who are on retainer. Easier to track them separately. It made sense on the surface. I nodded. I moved on, but something caught. A small hook in the back of my mind. The kind of feeling I used to get on a job site when a system was reading normal, but the sound was wrong. Not an alarm. Just a vibration that didn't belong. I'd spent 3 decades trusting that instinct with machines, but I'd never had to apply it to my own son. The second thing happened at Dale's funeral. It was a clear day, one of those Charlotte mornings where the sky is so blue it almost hurts. The service was at a small church in Dilworth, and afterward people came back to my house. Gil Thornton was there. I hadn't seen Gil in maybe 2 years. He was older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. Wearing a suit that fit him the way suits fit men who don't wear them often. He shook my hand, said something kind about Dale, and pressed something into my palm. A flash drive. Small, black, unremarkable. He said, quiet enough that no one else heard, "Dale gave me this about a month before he passed. Said you should have it when the time was right." I put it in my jacket pocket and forgot about it. There was casserole to deal with, and people's grief, and the endless logistics of death. Weeks passed. I continued the transition. Trent was efficient, present, helpful. He came by the office regularly, brought me lunch sometimes, walked me through the billing software with patience I appreciated. He was performing the role of a son, stepping into his father's son. And he was performing it well. But the hook kept catching. Small things. Trent's phone always face down on the table. The way he'd redirect conversations away from specific client accounts. the fact that he'd changed his office hours so that he was often in the building alone in the evenings. A Tuesday where I stopped by unannounced and found his door locked, which had never happened before. My body was responding to these signals before my conscious mind was willing to process them. Sleep got harder. Not insomnia exactly, but a low-grade alertness. Like my nervous system was running a background scan I hadn't authorized. I'd wake at 3 a.m. and lie in the dark and think about the managed portfolio folder and the locked door and the face-down phone, and then I'd tell myself I was being paranoid, that grief had made me suspicious, that Connie would tell me to trust our son. Then Gil Thornton called on a Sunday evening. I was sitting on the back porch, watching the last light drain out of the sky. His voice was careful, measured. "Marcus, I need to show you something in person. Don't mention this call to your son. Can I drive down tomorrow?" He was in Raleigh, 2 hours away. He said he'd be at my house by 9 a.m. Gil arrived at 8:45. With a thermos of coffee and a different flash drive than the one he'd given me at the funeral. This one was red. He sat at my kitchen table and opened a laptop and plugged the drive in and said, "I've been tracking anomalies in the firm's financials for 14 months, since before Dale died." 14 months. Gil Thornton, the silent partner who attended 0 meetings, who I barely thought about most years, had been running his own quiet investigation for over a year. He'd noticed the same vibration I'd felt, except he'd noticed it earlier and he'd done something about it. He opened a QuickBooks file. The first thing he showed me was a list of 4 clients: Richard Pham, Walter Albright, Curtis Yates, Donald McKee. All of them had been billing active, with monthly invoices going out and payments coming in for the entire period Gil had been watching. All 4 of them were dead. Richard Pham died in October 2021. Walter Albright in March 2022. Curtis Yates in August 2022. Donald McKee in January 2023. Gil had pulled their obituaries. He'd printed them out. He laid them on my kitchen table next to the invoice records, 4 dead men's faces next to the bills still being sent in their names. The payments weren't coming back to Ellison and Thornton Mechanical Consulting. They were being routed to an LLC called Ridgeline Services, registered at a commercial address in Wilmington, North Carolina. Gil showed me the registration. The registered agent was a name I didn't recognize at first, Tyler Page. I stared at it for a long time before my son's college roommate's face surfaced in my memory. Tyler Page. He'd been at our Thanksgiving table twice. Connie had made him a plate to take home. I remember the precise physical sensation of that moment. My hands were flat on the kitchen table, and the wood grain was pressing into my palms, and the room was very still and very bright, and my body understood what my mind was still trying to refuse. The coffee Gil had brought tasted like metal in my mouth. My jaw locked. My breathing became something I had to manage consciously. Inhale through the nose for 4 counts. Hold. Exhale through the mouth. The same way I used to breathe when I was working in a confined space on a job site, and the walls felt too close. Gil sat across from me and didn't speak. He'd been there through his own version of this moment, alone, months ago. He knew there was nothing to say that would make the numbers mean something different. $612,000 across 34 months, invoiced to dead men, paid to a shell company, run by my son's college roommate, from my brother's firm. From my firm. Gil told me something that night I'll never forget. He said he'd almost destroyed the flash drive twice. Twice he'd held it over his kitchen trash can and nearly let it fall. He said, "I kept thinking maybe Dale would have wanted me to handle it quietly. Maybe I was wrong about what I was seeing. Maybe there was an explanation." What finally pushed him was finding an invoice billed to Curtis Yates. Gil had attended Curtis Yates' funeral. He'd sat in the 3rd pew and listened to Curtis's daughter talk about her father's 30 years in the HVAC industry and how the man had died in his garden pulling weeds. Gil went home from that funeral and found a fresh invoice in Curtis's name dated 2 weeks later. That's when he called the forensic CPA. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Dale's office, Dale's brass nameplate on the windowsill catching the street light, and I went through Gil's files, line by line. The engineer in me took over. I stopped being a father and became an auditor. I cross-referenced every invoice against the client, death dates Gil had documented. I checked routing numbers. I tracked payment patterns. By 3 a.m, the shape of the thing was clear. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a shortcut. This was a system. Built deliberately, maintained consistently, hidden behind a restructured database that kept the dead clients in a folder I was never supposed to open. That's when I remembered the flash drive from the funeral. The one Gil had said came from Dale. I found it in my jacket pocket, still in the closet where I'd hung the suit. I plugged it in. It contained one file, a memo Dale had written to himself, dated 3 weeks before his stroke. 2 sentences. Something's wrong with the managed portfolio accounts. I need to talk to Marcus. He never got to talk to me. He was on the floor of his office 3 weeks later, and then he was gone. And Trent was standing at the graveside with his arm around my shoulder saying, "I'll take care of everything, Dad." I sat in that office chair, and I heard those words echo, and I felt something shift inside me that I can only describe as a door closing. The part of me that needed Trent to be innocent, the part that Connie had fed and tended, the part that wanted Dale's letter to be right about the kid being ready, that part didn't die exactly. It just went very quiet. And in its place, something older and colder and more precise took over. The engineer, the systems man, the one who doesn't hope a compressor is running clean, the one who opens the panel and checks. I started checking. The first thing I did was pull the firm's insurance policy. This is the thing you do in mechanical consulting when you think liability might be exposed. You check the insurance. What I found made the chair feel like it was tilting beneath me. 3 months after Dale's death, Trent had changed the authorized signatories on the firm's policy. He'd removed my name. I was the majority partner, and I was no longer authorized on our own insurance. The form had my name printed on it as the party being removed, and Trent's signature at the bottom, and the date was circled in my mind like a bruise. 3 months after Dale died. While I was still bringing flowers to Connie's grave every Sunday and trusting my son to run the office, I stared at that document and my hands went cold. Not figuratively. The blood drained from my fingers and I had to flex them to feel the keyboard. Because this wasn't just billing fraud anymore. This was insulation. Trent wasn't just stealing. He was building walls between the theft and anyone who might stop it. Removing me from the insurance meant I couldn't file a claim, couldn't trigger an audit, couldn't even access the policy details without his authorization. He'd locked me out of my own firm's protections while bringing me homemade chili and calling me Dad. I called Gil. It was after midnight. He answered on the second ring, like he'd been waiting. I told him about the insurance change. There was a long silence. Then Gil said, "There's more. I didn't show you everything today because I wanted to see if you'd find it on your own. You need to look at a company called Blue Laurel Consulting." Blue Laurel Consulting. I searched the North Carolina Secretary of State's Business Registry. There it was, an LLC registered under the name Kayla Morin. Morin was Trent's wife, Kayla's maiden name. Blue Laurel Consulting was receiving monthly payments labeled consulting fees from Ridgeline Services, Tyler Page's LLC, the one collecting the dead client's money. The money was being layered, stolen from the firms through fake invoices, routed to Ridgeline, then passed through Blue Laurel as consulting fees before it reached Trent's personal accounts. 2 shells, 2 layers of distance. Between the fraud and my son's bank account, I printed the Blue Laurel registration and laid it on the desk next to the Ridgeline registration, next to the dead client's obituaries, next to the insurance change form. Dale's brass nameplate sat on the windowsill, watching. I looked at that nameplate, and I thought about Dale's memo. Something's wrong with the managed portfolio accounts. My brother had seen it. He'd seen the edges of it, at least. And then he died before he could tell me. And Trent had stood at the funeral and shook hands and accepted condolences, and the whole time the system was running, the invoices were going out. The dead men were still being billed. The forensic CPA Gil had hired was a woman named Diane Weber. I met her at a coffee shop in South End, away from the office, away from anywhere Trent might see us. She was mid-50s, silver reading glasses, the kind of stillness that comes from years of looking at numbers that tell ugly stories. She'd been working with Gil's files for 2 months before I got involved. She set her pen down, looked at me over her glasses, and said, "Mr. Ellison, this is not an accident. This is a constructed system of financial fraud with deliberate layering, deliberate obfuscation, and deliberate timing. Your son waited until your brother died, and you were grieving to accelerate the extraction." Deliberate timing. The invoices to dead clients had started while Dale was still alive, but the volume increased after Dale's stroke. The insurance change happened within the first quarter after Dale's death. The second LLC was registered 6 weeks after the funeral. My grief was part of his timeline, my absence from the office, my inability to focus on anything but getting through each day without Connie, my trust in the son she'd believed in so completely. All of it was operational. It was infrastructure. I was the vulnerability in the system, and my son had engineered around me. What happened next was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I've held my wife's hand while she died. I went back to acting normal. The masquerade started the following Monday. I went to the office. I smiled at Trent. I asked about the transition paperwork. I sat in meetings and nodded at things he said. And my body was a suit I was wearing, every muscle under deliberate control. My jaw ached by noon from the effort of not clenching it. I ate lunch with him at a sandwich shop on East Boulevard, and the bread tasted like paper in my mouth because my stomach was running on adrenaline and nothing else. Trent talked about the firm's future, about new clients he was bringing in, about how we should update the website, about how Dale would have been proud. He said that Dale would have been proud. And I watched his mouth form the words, and I thought about Dale's memo. In a flash drive, in my jacket. And I said, "He sure would have, son." My voice sounded normal. I know it did because Trent didn't flinch, didn't look at me twice, didn't sense anything. I was performing the role of a trusting father, and I was performing it flawlessly. And the cost of that performance was something I carried in my chest like a stone. There was an evening, a Wednesday, when Trent stopped by the office unexpectedly. I was at the desk, the laptop open, the QuickBooks file from Gil's flash drive on the screen. I heard the front door, and my heart rate went from 60 to 120. In the time it took him to walk down the hallway, I closed the laptop. When he opened the office door, I was leaning back in the chair with my reading glasses on my forehead, the picture of a retired engineer checking his email. "Horzio, hey Dad, burning the midnight oil? Just looking at some old correspondence. Your uncle kept everything." Trent glanced at the laptop, at the desk, at Dale's nameplate on the windowsill. Then he smiled and said he'd left his phone charger in the conference room. He found it. He left. I sat in the dark for 20 minutes after his taillights disappeared, and my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't open the laptop again. The almost caught moment. The moment that lives in my body as a specific temperature, a specific tightness in my throat, a specific awareness of how thin the membrane was between my investigation and his discovery of it. Gil was the one who kept me from confronting Trent too early. 3 times I called Gil and said I was done. I was going to his house. I was going to put the printouts on his kitchen table and watch his face. 3 times Gil said the same thing. Not yet. We need more. We need it. Airtight. Your son is smart, Marcus. If you go in with 90%, he'll live in the 10% you missed. Gil was right. I hated that he was right. The next discovery came not from a spreadsheet, but from a phone call. A woman named Barbara Yates called the office. She was Curtis Yates's daughter. Curtis, the man whose funeral Gil had attended. The man who'd been dead since August 2022. Barbara was calling because she'd received an invoice addressed to her father. She was confused and upset. She said, "My father passed away over a year ago. Why is your firm still billing him?" I took the call. I played ignorant. I said there must be a database error, that I'd look into it personally. And then I asked Barbara if she'd mind if I recorded the conversation for our records. She said she didn't mind at all. She said she'd been trying to reach someone at the firm for 2 months and kept getting Trent's voicemail, and he never called back. I recorded every word. When I hung up, I saved the file and added it to the evidence folder that was growing on my own personal drive, a drive I kept in the glove compartment of my truck. Never in the office, never in the house where Trent might stop by. Then there was the voicemail. This is the thing I can't describe without my voice changing. Even now. Even from this distance. I was in Dale's office late one night, going through old files, and I checked the office answering machine. It was an old machine, the kind with a tape. Dale had never upgraded it. I pressed play and listened through a string of routine messages. Vendor confirmations, appointment reminders, the ordinary debris of a small business. And then Trent's voice. He was talking to someone, a colleague, maybe Tyler Page, I don't know. The message had been left accidentally, a pocket dial or a call that went to the wrong line. Trent's voice was casual, relaxed, almost amused. He said, "Dad's too old school to check anything digital. He still thinks a handshake means something. That's why this works." I was holding a cup of coffee. I set it down because my hands were shaking too hard to keep it from spilling. The ceramic made a sound against the desk that I can still hear. The room was completely dark except for the desk lamp, and Dale's brass nameplate was right there, right at the edge of the light. And my son's voice was coming out of this machine telling someone that my trust was his operating advantage. I sat motionless for 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because the desk clock was in my line of sight, and I watched the numbers change. 4 minutes where I didn't move, didn't breathe in any way I was conscious of, didn't think in words. My body was processing something my mind refused to language. When the 4 minutes passed, I reached over and pressed save, and then I sat there for a while longer and looked at that brass nameplate, and I said, out loud, to no one, to Dale maybe, "I'm going to take care of it if you're still listening to this. If something about this story has a grip on your chest right now, I want you to do something for me. Hit subscribe, leave a comment. Because these stories need to be heard by the people who are living them right now, the ones sitting in a dark office at midnight, holding proof of their own betrayal, and trying to figure out what comes next." The final pieces came together in a sequence that felt almost mechanical. My own accountant, a man named Howard Cho, who'd done my personal taxes for 15 years, confirmed that Trent had been accelerating the business transition paperwork. The filings to transfer full ownership to Trent were scheduled for the following Monday. 6 days from when, Howard told me. Trent was trying to get the firm in his name before the fiscal year audit, which would have triggered exactly the kind of review that would expose everything. 6 days. That was my window. If Trent's paperwork went through on Monday, he'd own the firm. He'd control the accounts, the records, the insurance, everything. And the evidence Gil and Diane and I had assembled would become exponentially harder to act on because the chain of authorization would change. I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Kwan. I told her everything. She listened for 45 minutes without interrupting, which is how I knew it was serious, because Patricia charges $400 an hour. And she doesn't spend that kind of time listening unless the situation warrants it. When I finished, she said, we need to freeze the transition filing before Monday. I can do that. But Marcus, once I do that, your son will know something is wrong. Then we need to be ready before Monday. We were ready by Thursday. The forensic audit was completed on Tuesday. Diane Weber delivered a 42-page report documenting every fabricated invoice, every payment routing, every LLC registration, every timeline correlation between Dale's death and the acceleration of the fraud. The firm's insurance carrier received the report on Wednesday. Their fraud division opened a file and assigned an investigator, a man named James Okafor, who called me Thursday morning and said he'd be available for a meeting whenever I was ready. I was ready. The masquerade had one last act, Wednesday night, 2 days before the confrontation. Trent came to the house with a pot of homemade chili. He stood in my kitchen and stirred it on the stove and said, "Mom would have wanted us to do this together, Dad." He invoked her. He used Connie's memory as a tool. He stood in the kitchen where she'd made 10,000 meals and wielded her ghost like a prop. And I stood 3 feet away and said, "She sure would have, son." And my voice didn't crack. My face didn't change. My hands stayed at my sides. But something inside me finalized. The last filament of doubt. The last thread of maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's an explanation. Maybe Connie's faith was justified. That thread burned through and fell away. And what was left was just the facts and the filing cabinet in my truck and the meeting I'd scheduled for Friday morning. Trent hugged me at the door when he left. I hugged him back, and my skin crawled. That is not a metaphor. My skin physically reacted to the contact, a sensation like touching a live wire at low voltage, every nerve saying wrong, wrong, wrong. I closed the door behind him and stood in the hallway and breathed and looked at the photo on the wall. Connie and Trent at his college graduation. Her arm through his. Her face lit up with a pride that was absolute and unconditional. And I now understood, aimed at a person who had never fully existed, who had never. Thursday night, I sat in Dale's office one last time. I reviewed the complete evidence file, every document, every printout, every recording, the invoices to dead men, the LLC registrations, the insurance change, the voicemail, Barbara Yates's recorded phone call, Diane Weber's 42-page forensic audit, the insurance carrier's file number, Patricia Kwan's motion to freeze the transition paperwork, already filed with the court, already granted, already in effect. Trent's Monday filing was dead before he knew it existed. I looked at the totality of what I'd assembled, and I felt something I didn't expect. Not anger, not satisfaction, grief. Because what was spread across that desk was not just evidence of fraud, it was the autopsy of a relationship. Every page was a moment I'd trusted someone who was counting my trust as a business advantage. Every routing number was a meal we'd shared while the money moved. Every date on every invoice corresponded to a day I'd been alive and grieving and believing. And he'd been stealing. Dale's nameplate sat on the windowsill. I picked it up. It was heavy, solid brass, cool in my hand. Dale Ellison, partner. I held it and thought about my brother's last memo. Something's wrong with the managed portfolio accounts. Dale had known. He'd sensed the same vibration, and the stroke had taken him before he could follow it to its source. I followed it, I said to the nameplate. I found it. Friday morning, 9 o'clock. The conference room at Ellison and Thornton Mechanical Consulting. The table was dark walnut, 8 chairs, a window overlooking the parking lot. I'd been there since 7, arranging things. The room was cool, the thermostat set to 68, which I knew because I'd installed the system myself 15 years ago, and I checked it that morning out of pure habit. The engineer unable to stop engineering, even on the morning he was going to end his son's career. Patricia Kwan arrived at 8:15. She set her briefcase on the table and opened it, and laid out her documents with the precision of a surgeon preparing instruments. James Okafor, from the insurance carrier's fraud division, arrived at 8:30. He was a tall man, calm, wearing a navy suit, and a badge on a lanyard that he placed face up on the table in front of his chair. Howard Cho, my accountant, arrived at 8:40. He looked like he hadn't slept, which made two of us. Trent arrived at 9:05. He was wearing a pressed shirt, khakis, clean shoes. He looked good. He looked like a man stepping into his inheritance. He shook hands with Patricia, who he'd met before. He shook hands with Howard, who he'd never met. He looked at James Okafor and the badge on the table, and his eyes paused, just a fraction of a second, before he extended his hand and said, "I don't think we've met." "James Okafor. I'm with the firm's insurance carrier." Right, of course. Great to have everyone here." Trent sat down. He adjusted his chair. He pulled it close to the table and set his hands flat on the surface, the way I'd taught him to sit in business meetings when he was 23. Confident posture, open hands, nothing to hide. I had taught him that. I had taught him how to perform trustworthiness. I let him relax. I want you to understand that. I let 12 full minutes pass. I talked about the transition. I talked about the firm's legacy. I talked about Dale, about how Dale had wanted this, had put it in writing. I talked about how much the business meant to our family. I watched Trent's shoulders drop, watched his breathing settle, watched the tension around his eyes smooth out as he decided this was exactly what he'd expected. A formality, a passing of the torch, an old man handing over the keys. At the 12-minute mark, I opened a manila folder and slid a sheet of paper across the table. It was a single page, a spreadsheet, 34 rows. Each row contained a client name, an invoice number, a billing date, and a routing destination. Every client on the list was dead. Every invoice was fabricated. Every payment had been routed to Ridgeline Services LLC. Trent looked at the paper. I watched his eyes move down the rows. I watched the color begin to leave his face, starting at the jaw, moving upward, like watching a tide recede. His hands were still flat on the table, but the fingers had gone rigid. "I found these 6 weeks ago," I said. My voice was level. I'd practiced it. Not in a mirror, not out loud, but in my head. Over and over, in Dale's office at 2 a.m, while the nameplate watched. The forensic audit finished last Tuesday. The firm's insurance carrier filed their report yesterday morning. Trent looked at me, then at James Okafor, then at the badge on the table, then back at me. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Dad, let me explain." The insurance carrier already has their report, Trent. "This meeting isn't a discussion, it's a notification." That sentence landed like a door closing. I saw it hit him. I saw the exact moment he understood that this wasn't the beginning of a conversation. This was the end of one. Every action that mattered had already been taken. The forensic audit was done. The insurance report was filed. The transition paperwork was frozen. He was sitting at a table where every person except him already knew everything. "There's more," I said. I slid the Ridgeline Services LLC registration across the table, Tyler Page's name, the Wilmington address. "You routed the payments through your college roommate's company?" Trent stared at the document. His jaw was working, the muscles bunching and releasing, and I recognized the motion because I'd seen it in my own mirror every morning of the masquerade. It's not what it looks like. Tyler and I set that up for overflow work. Legitimate overflow, consulting jobs that were outside the firm's scope. It was never. I slid the next document. Blue Laurel Consulting, Kayla Marin. His wife's maiden name. Payments from Ridgeline to Blue Laurel. Consulting fees. The layering. Then explain why a second company, registered under your wife's maiden name, is receiving money from the first company. Walk me through the consulting services Blue Laurel provided to Ridgeline. Silence. Not the silence of someone thinking. The silence of someone whose next 3 prepared responses have all been preempted. I saw his eyes flick to Patricia Kwan, trying to read her, trying to determine if she was his ally or mine. She met his gaze without expression. Dad, listen to me. I was going to tell you. I was going to bring this to you and explain. The managed portfolio, 4 of the clients in that portfolio are dead, Trent. I slid the obituaries across the table. 4 pages, 4 faces. Richard Pham, Walter Albright, Curtis Yates, Donald McKee. Richard Pham died in October 2021. You billed him in November 2021. December 2021. You billed him every month for 2 years after he died. Trent's hand moved to the obituaries, then stopped. He didn't touch them. His fingers hovered over the pages like they were hot. Curtis Yates's daughter called the office, I continued. I set my phone on the table and pressed play. Barbara Yates's voice filled the conference room, clear and confused and hurt, asking why her dead father was still receiving invoices. When it ended, the room was very quiet. Trent leaned back in his chair. The posture I'd taught him was gone. He was folding in on himself, shoulders rounding, hands coming off the table and into his lap. The confident young businessman dissolving into something smaller. The insurance change, I said. I slid the form across the table, his signature at the bottom, removing my name from the policy. 3 months after Dale died, you took me off the firm's insurance, while I was still grieving your mother and trusting you to run the office. That was administrative. That was just... It was insulation. You removed the majority partner's authorization so I couldn't trigger an audit or file a claim. You locked me out of the firm's own protections. His voice changed then. It went from defensive to something harder, sharper, cornered. You don't understand how this business works, Dad. You've been out of it for years. Dale handled things his own way, and I handle things mine. And not everything that looks irregular is... I pressed play on the answering machine recording. My phone's speaker was small, but in that quiet room, Trent's voice came through with perfect clarity. Dad's too old school to check anything digital. He still thinks a handshake means something. That's why this works. The conference room went completely still. James Okafor set his pen down. Patricia Kwan closed her eyes for 1 second and opened them. Howard Cho looked at the table. Trent stared at the phone. The recording ended. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. "Where did you get that?" Trent said. Not a question, a statement. Flat. The voice of someone who has just heard the sound of the last door closing. "From your uncle's answering machine. The one in the office you've been using for 6 years. You left a voicemail on it by accident. It's saved." Something happened to Trent's face that I will carry for the rest of my life. The mask came off. Not dramatically, not in a burst of rage or a collapse of tears. It came off the way a building comes down in controlled demolition. Floor by floor, each layer of performance falling away in sequence until what was left was just the structure, the bare frame, the thing that had been holding everything else up. And what was under the mask was not the sun I'd raised. It was a stranger, someone who had built a system to extract money from dead men's names using his dead uncle's business and his grieving father's trust, and who had done it with the steady hand of a professional. "Dad," his voice cracked. I was in over my head. Tyler approached me with the idea, and I should have said no, but the money was $612,000, I said. 34 months, 4 dead clients, 2 shell companies. You weren't in over your head, you were swimming. He put his head in his hands. James Okafor spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "Mr. Ellison," he said, addressing Trent, "the carrier's fraud division has completed its review. A formal report was filed with our legal department 6 days ago. You'll be receiving correspondence from our attorneys within the week, Patricia Kwan added quietly. The court granted a temporary restraining order, freezing the business transition on Wednesday. The filing you had scheduled for Monday has been stayed. Trent's head came up. Monday. You knew about Monday. Your accountant's office confirmed the accelerated timeline, I said. You were trying to get the firm in your name before the fiscal year audit would have caught the irregularities. Howard identified the pattern. Howard Cho nodded once but said nothing. Trent looked around the table, at each face, at each document spread before him, at the badge, the phone, the obituaries, the LLC registrations, the insurance form, the spreadsheet. He was doing the math, not financial math, temporal math, calculating how long I'd known, how long I'd sat across from him and smiled and eaten his chili and said she sure would have, while the trap was being built around him, nail by nail, document by document, filing by filing. How long? He said. 6 weeks. 6 weeks. He said it like he was tasting something he'd never encountered before. The flavor of being the one who didn't know. The experience of sitting across from someone who was performing normalcy while holding the truth. I wondered if he recognized the taste. I wondered if it was anything like the taste of paper bread and metal coffee that I'd been living with for 42 days. You sat with me at lunch, he said. You ate dinner at my house. You let me bring you chili. Yes. And the whole time, he stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. For a moment, I thought he was going to walk out, and Patricia was already shifting her weight forward to remind him that the meeting included a formal acknowledgement of the restraining order. But he didn't walk out. He stood there behind his chair, his hands on the backrest, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before and hope never to see again. It was the face of someone realizing they are not the smartest person in the room, that they have never been the smartest person in the room, and that the person they underestimated most was the one sitting 3 feet away with a manila folder and a steady voice. And 31 years of engineering discipline that they dismissed as being old school. Mom would have... I said one word. The only word in the entire meeting that I delivered with anything other than clinical control. It came out low and hard, and it hit the air between us like something physical. Don't bring your mother into this room. He sat back down. He was quiet for the rest of the meeting. Patricia walked him through the restraining order. James Okafor outlined the carrier's next steps. I sat across from my son and watched him receive information about the systematic demolition of everything he'd built on top of everything I'd built. And the only thing I felt was the weight of the brass nameplate that I'd left on the office windowsill because I couldn't bring Dale into this room either. The weeks that followed were an architecture of consequence. The insurance carrier's fraud investigation became a civil litigation case. Trent was named as the primary defendant. Tyler Page was named as a co-conspirator. The 3 deceased clients' estates, represented by their families, filed restitution demands totaling $480,000. Richard Pham's son, Walter Albright's widow, Curtis Yates's daughter, Barbara, the same woman whose phone call I'd recorded. Trent tried to get ahead of the story. He called family members, friends, former colleagues. He told a version where the shell companies were legitimate side ventures, where the dead client invoices were database errors, where his father was an aging widower who'd been manipulated by Gil Thornton into seeing fraud, where there was only disorganization. He told this version with the same easy confidence, the same firm handshake, the same eye contact that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. It lasted about 10 days. Then Diane Weber's forensic audit started reaching the same people Trent had called. 42 pages of documented, cross-referenced, time-stamped financial evidence. Each person who'd heard Trent's version now held a document that contradicted it in specific, verifiable detail. His credibility didn't collapse from a single blow. It collapsed from the accumulation of contradictions, each one small enough to explain away individually, but together forming a pattern that no handshake and no eye contact could survive. His wife Kayla filed for separation within 4 months. I don't know the private details, and I don't want to. I know that Blue Laurel Consulting, the LLC in her maiden name, made her a participant in the fraud, whether she understood the full scope or not. I know that her attorney contacted Patricia Kwan about distinguishing Kayla's liability from Trent's, which tells you something about where that marriage stood once the documents were on the table. The firm survived, barely. Gil and I restructured. We brought in a new operations manager, a woman Dale had once recommended. We lost 2 clients who didn't want to be associated with the publicity. We kept the rest because the rest had been honestly served for 15 years, and their system still worked, and their buildings were still cool in summer and warm in winter, because I had engineered them to be. I went through the house after the confrontation and saw everything differently. The kitchen where Trent made chili was just a kitchen now. The counter where he'd stood and invoked his mother while laundering money through dead men's names. The hallway where he'd hug me goodbye was just a hallway. The walls didn't carry the warmth I'd imagined. They carried the echo of a performance, but the photo stayed. The one of Connie and Trent at his college graduation. I took it down and held it and looked at Connie's face. The absolute radiance of her belief in him. And I couldn't throw it away. Not because of Trent, because of her. The woman in that photo deserved to have been right. She deserved a son who was worth that pride. She didn't get one. But the love she felt in that moment was real, even if its object wasn't. And I wasn't going to discard the last image of her joy because he'd proven unworthy of it. Dale's brass nameplate, I put in a drawer. Not thrown away. Just put away. It had sat on that windowsill through every late night discovery, every document printed, every recording saved. It had watched the whole investigation from its perch by the glass. It had seen enough. Gil and I started talking on Thursdays. Every Thursday evening, 7 o'clock, he calls or I call and we talk about nothing important. The weather in Raleigh. A restaurant one of us tried. A book neither of us has finished. Sometimes we mention Dale. Briefly. The way you mention someone who's still in the room. We never talk about the investigation. We don't need to. It lives in the space between the words we do say. A shared weight that made 2 acquaintances into something closer than friends. Gil Thornton, the silent partner I barely thought about for 15 years, turned out to be the most honest person in my entire life. Some time has passed now. It's December as I'm telling you this. I'm sitting on the back porch of the Charlotte house. The air is cold, and the sky is that particular winter gray that makes the trees look like pencil drawings. I've got a mug of coffee that's going tepid because I keep forgetting to drink it, which is not like me, because I time everything. But some evenings the routine loosens its grip, and I just sit. Trent and I haven't spoken in 2 months. The litigation is ongoing. The restitution demands are working through the system. His attorney communicates with Patricia Kwan, and that's the extent of the relationship. I don't know where he's living. I don't know if he's working. I know that the version of fatherhood I practiced for 30 years, the version Connie and I built together, the version where you raise a child and trust the person they become, that version ended in a conference room on a Friday morning, with 4 obituaries on a walnut table. I keep the photo on the mantle. Connie's arm through Trent's, her face like sunlight. I look at it most evenings, and what I feel is not the clean resolution of a man who exposed the truth and moved on. What I feel is the complicated, heavy, unsortable weight of a father who did the right thing and lost his son in the process, or maybe lost a son he never actually had, because the person I thought I raised may have been a performance from much further back than I'm ready to examine. I used to think that trust was the foundation of family, that if you gave it fully and consistently, it would be returned. I was wrong. Trust is not a foundation. It's a bridge, and bridges require maintenance from both sides. When one person stops maintaining their side and starts mining the materials for personal use, the bridge doesn't just weaken, it becomes a liability. The very thing connecting you becomes the mechanism of your exposure. I also learned this. The pain of knowing is different from the pain of not knowing, but it's not less. It's just cleaner. It cuts where the other one gnaws. And given the choice, and I was given the choice, every time I picked up that flash drive, every time I opened another file, every time I played that voicemail at midnight in a dark office, I was choosing the clean cut over the slow gnaw. I would make that choice again, not because it hurt less, because the wound it left could heal. If someone in your family is rushing you to sign something today, not tomorrow, not next week, today, I need you to hear me. The people who love you can wait until Monday. The people who can't wait until Monday are not protecting you. They are protecting a timeline. And the question you should be asking is whose timeline and why does it expire before you've had a chance to read the fine print? That's the story. One flash drive handed across a kitchen table by a man who almost threw it away twice. One answering machine that saved a voicemail it was never meant to save. And one brass nameplate in a drawer that watched the whole thing from a windowsill. If any of this landed, if you've ever looked at a number that didn't add up and felt the floor shift under your feet, or if you've ever sat across from someone you love and known something they didn't know you knew, tell me about it. Leave a comment. I read them all. Subscribe if